Welcome back, business law students. Today we're going to talk about environmental protection, environmental laws, etc. Why are these important? Well, just being a good citizen and moral and ethical decisions aside, I've seen companies go bankrupt by not following, appropriate environmental rules, regulations, whether they be city, state, or federal, and going bankrupt or having to move business. Just these are very serious. Aside from the fact that it's morally the right thing to do, these are very serious laws, and they could cause catastrophic consequences financially to your company if not followed. So I think it's important that you have an overview in addition to your textbook of what they include. All right, I'll move to the materials so we can go through them. As you will recall, for hundreds of years, there was something called the common law, and that basically was judge-made law is one way to think of it. But essentially, when, let's say, one landowner owners, he had some smelting operation in the 1700s. Well, if he allowed the chemicals and the metals, whatever, to leach onto his neighbors' property and ruined it, well, they had a common law right to bring an action for nuisance or trespass, however one characterizes it. And this is still available that you can bring an action for somebody for ruining your lawn or your property and causing damages. And here's the steps that you have to show that the person, the wrongdoer, has used the manner that used their property in a manner that unreasonably interferes with yours. The court can look at a balance of harm versus costs of stopping the harm. And then there is a distinction between a public nuisance and a private nuisance. Now, a public nuisance, um, on a private nuisance, you're saying, hey, this affected my property. So that's a private nuisance you sue. But there's also things called a public nuisance where, a group of people might sue against a big company that's harming a forest or something like that. Now, you might recall that we talked about torts, not contract law this time, but torts. And that's one example is where you're driving and you look down at your phone and you hit someone, not on purpose. Well, you would be known as being negligent, and whomever sued you would sue you for being negligent. You didn't follow your duty of due care. You looked down at your phone when you shouldn't have. However, in some instances, the law has created what's known as strict liability for hazardous activities, certain products liability. And basically, while in a negligence lawsuit, you're proving this person didn't do due diligence. Well, if your company engages in what's known as an ultra hazardous activity, let's say they transport hazardous waste, they process really serious chemicals that can, cause caustic damage or death. Well, they are business known as business that are engaged in ultra hazardous activities. Let's say, I think, yeah, the example here is asbestos. You used asbestos back in the day. Well, whoever's suing you doesn't have to prove you were negligent. You can just, because they were engaged in that and there was resulting harm, that's enough to win a lawsuit, essentially. Uh, yep, here it is. Asbestos, radiation, hazardous waste, etc., are common toxic torts where there is strict liability. All right, I'd like you to pause. This is a good video, 15 minutes long, but whether you do it after this lesson or pause and do this and come back, I don't care. But please watch this because it has a really good overview of environmental law principles and a little bit of the history. Now, who is regulating and engaging these things? Well, um, many states do. I've worked with the good people, and I mean that sincerely, working at the Department of Environmental Quality from Oklahoma, and they uh, might regulate things such as discharges that you have from your plant, where you can take your waste, especially where you put waste that has hazardous or toxic materials in it. Also, states or cities might regulate things. For example, the city of Tulsa, in our where I live, regulates the wastewater that comes from your facility, comes from your plant, to make sure A, you're not putting bad things into public streams. B, you're not, causing undue erosion, et cetera, et cetera. But there's various things that they fortunately do to monitor the waterways, for example, to ensure there's not a lot of bad stuff going into the public waterways. Now, this is just some of the main federal um, statutes of which you should be aware. How do I know that it's a federal statute? Well, in addition to general familiarity, when I look over here for where the statute is, it says 33 USC, and USC does not stand for University of Southern California. It stands for the United States Code. So if you ever see a USC, that means it's a federal statute or federal, and then there'll be federal regulations. Rivers and Harbor Appropriation Act, I think that's self-explanatory. Um, it really, and as old as I am, I remember, oh, good heavens, a really worse environmental situation than it is today. Yeah, we still have problems, but it was so bad. Well, it might have been, good heavens, was it the Cuyahoga River in the 70s that was so polluted that it started on fire when someone was smoking or something? There was so much gasoline or something in that literally a river was on fire, and that was sort of a bellwether to tell the American public and consciousness it is time to clean up our waterways. We can't continue to live this way. Insecticide, fungicide, etc. Well, pesticides and herbicides that you used, whether at your home or on a large farm. So these are regulated as well, and they have to comport with this safety mostly. Water Pollution Control Act, same thing, but it's not ships and ship manufacturers, it's pollutants going into navigable waters. Clean Air Act, that is a big one. And whenever you buy a automobile, when you buy a car or truck, it has to comply with Clean Air Act regulations to about how much bad stuff is put out in the air. Ocean Dumping Act, back in the day, even radiological materials from study, whether it's nuclear energy processing or nuclear weapons, sometimes just spent fuel would be dumped in the ocean. So that's one of the things that this covers. Endangered Species Act. This has helped various species come back, and when you'll usually see it in the news, it's things like a new road is being built, a golf course or something, and there's an endangered species that is in danger of uh, becoming extinct if this activity continues or this such and such. So we often see that, but there are also steps to protect these endangered species. Safe Drinking Water Act, that addresses pollutants in public water systems. Toxic Substance Control Act, that's a big one. So if you're using any kind of a toxic chemical in your business, and a lot of manufacturing processes do, whether it's, anyway, there's a lot. And this basically controls a lot of times how it is disposed of. Is it burned? I mean, how is it taken care of so it doesn't get in the waterways, in the soil, etc. CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response, that's a big one for they once the feds get involved, they're like, holy cow, this is a big, horrible pollution area. They'll designate it a Superfund site, and there's all sorts of regulations on who's responsible, who has to pay, and et cetera. And there'll be serious cleanup efforts. Right. National Environmental Policy Act. That I'll let you read in your book about this, but that really is comprehensive. Anything that has potential negative environmental impact, and if it's serious enough, and this has to do with what the feds are doing. So let's say a government is building a new road, Air Force Base is expanding. Well, if there's a serious enough, it's a major federal action, then they're required to do an environmental impact statement, an EIS. And, or if there's no major impact, they don't have to do the EIS, but EIS will tell you, boy, this could really harm this and this, and you would have to do it in this manner, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big deal. So if your company gets involved in a major expansion, or maybe you're in the civil, like construction industry or something like that, you will see these from time to time. This is, you should all be familiar with this, the Air Pollution Clean Air Act. Like I said, anytime you buy a car, the CO2 emissions are controlled. When you see coal fire burning power plants or natural gas burning power plants, they have to um, follow maximal achievable control technology to minimize the pollutants that go into the air. All right. Another note on administrative agencies and the three branches of government, you may recall that most of these administrative agencies fall under the executive branch, which in the federal level, as opposed to the state level, is the president, well, the EPA, Department of Commerce, etc. And Congress will have a law which is pretty comprehensive, like the Clean Air Act. But then in order to promulgate the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of regulations implementing it, boy, what about CO2? What about this pollutant? What about this? And what do you have to do? And what do automobile, it's just very, very extensive. Those regulations are basically rules promulgated by, in this instance, the EPA, that's the agency. And so you'll have the law and then you'll have regulations rules that are promulgated. So usually when you're in business, you'll be adhering to the regulations as opposed to the statute per se. All right, water pollution, that's the Clean Water Act. And again, the real implementation comes from the regulations. And basically, that's a permitting system. I have to do clean water. I can't discharge such and such above a such and such level of pollutants from point sources. And again, similar to air, they have to use your company will have to use the best available control technology, the highest industry standard to minimize the pollution. Toxic chemicals and it's easy for me to say. Toxic chemicals and hazardous waste. We reference that. All you have to do is go to Lowe's or Home Depot, and you can just look at the warning labels on the various pesticides, which are required to be there. It'll also probably designate how you must dispose of these. And finally, as we talked about before, there's kind of a two-step environmental cleanup. The first one is RCRA, and under that federal statute and the regulations, they're determining what types of waste are toxic, hazardous, and then establish regulations to apply to those. And again, CERCLA, once you have found out that there's a site that is a Superfund site, it starts assessing liability and requiring by law people to clean up, including whoever generated the waste originally, who transported the waste to the site, who owned or operated the site at the time of disposal, even if you never used the hazardous waste, and the current owner or operator. So okay, people, you might save your company millions this way. Let's say you're on a team that's doing a merger or acquisition, and your company is thinking of buying an existing plant. Well, you do all the history of who owned and operated before and 100% of the chemicals they utilized in those operations. Because if you don't, and then later it's determined that they used hazardous chemicals, even though you don't, okay, you can still be liable for cleanup because you're the current owner or operator of the site. So save your company millions by doing the due diligence and making sure there's no hazardous chemicals or hazardous waste on anything you purchase or use. All right, that was quick. That's it. And I will see you next chapter. Thanks.